Hi, everyone. Welcome to our newest episode of Community Connection of the Lehigh Valley. I am Vicki Alersha, licensed professional counselor in Easton, PA, joined with my co-host, Mark Kenny. Mark, how are you?
I'm doing well, Vicki, and yourself
I'm doing all right. I'm excited
tonight.
for this episode.
Yes, I'm looking very much forward to learning about this organization.
Okay, wonderful. So before we get started by introducing our guest, we always like to share our disclaimer. So if anyone who is listening or viewing this video, if you find yourself struggling with any mental health symptoms, we strongly encourage you to reach out to anyone in your support system, medical doctor, therapist, caseworker, whoever's there to support you. And of course, us, if you would like us to support you as well. So I turn it over to Beth if you would like to introduce yourself and the organization that you're with.
Sure. Thanks, Vicki. Thanks, Mark. I'm Beth Tomlinson. I'm the Senior Director of Education at the United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley. In this role, I oversee all of our education initiatives, and I'm also the co-founder and lead staff for Resilient Lehigh Valley, which we're going to be talking about tonight. And just a little disclaimer of my own, although my title is education, I am not a teacher. I'm a social worker, and I've been in the social work field, always focused on youth and family for over 25 years.
Wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Sure.
So, Beth, can you start out by telling us what is Resilient Lehigh Valley and what are you hoping to achieve through this initiative?
Sure. Always happy to talk Resilient Lehigh Valley. Resilient Lehigh Valley is actually a cross-sector coalition focused on increasing youth resiliency through creating a trauma-informed, culture-responsive, and resilient Lehigh Valley. And of course, I'm home and I have dogs.
It's okay. We love dogs.
2 dogs. One's very quiet, and one's going a little senile and getting a little yippy out there. So what Resilient Lehigh Valley is doing is we're trying to create this, trauma-informed, culture-responsive, and resilient community through raising awareness on trauma and resiliency, particularly childhood trauma, racial trauma, providing trainings on trauma-informed care, supporting agencies and systems to adopt a trauma-informed approach. Of course, I have a husband, like 2 kids at home that could take the dog, but that's not happening, right?
It's okay. We're understanding. It's all right.
And we're also working on increasing cross-sector collaboration and communication, really break down silos between different systems to really better support youth, family, and community. And then always advocating for funding and policies that would promote trauma-informed care and healing. And actually, we started this really by about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Let's say 2016. So that's 5 years ago. We started this work really just with a focus on how do we get all of our schools to be trauma-informed schools with access to school-based behavioral health and really promoting and teaching everyday social emotional learning. That's really where we started. And then as we started that, we were like, okay, we're gaining traction, getting a lot of our schools and school districts in Lehigh Valley, at least, to really understand the impact of trauma in their schools, both on their youth, their families, and their staff. And then we pretty quickly realized that's great. This is great. But it's not just schools. It really is all systems that work with youth and families that we need to get this awareness. So, we really started with education, and now we're working with the health sector, human services, aging, housing, law enforcement, and actually just launched our first trauma-informed parenting program in partnership with Promise Neighborhood of Lehigh Valley. So lots of different things we're talking about, and I know we'll talk more about it tonight.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. It's fantastic to hear all the different avenues that you're trying to connect with, because it really isn't just about schools. It's really everyone, everywhere that should be educated about it. So that's great. Can you just give us a brief description of trauma, just to kind of educate our viewers of what it is?
Sure. I think it is important because when you say trauma, a lot of times people think of the medical trauma. We're not talking about physical, body trauma. we're talking about more on the mental health side of it. So in this context, trauma is the result of an overwhelming amount of stress from experiencing a situation or event that exceeds one's ability to cope. So it's not the event itself, right? It's what impact on the individual that event had. And an easy way that we talk about with folks to think about trauma is what we call the 3 E's of trauma. It's an event or series of events that the individual experiences, there we go, as physically, emotionally, or spiritually harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effect, right? Which could be 3 weeks or months, years. Effects like nightmares, anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks, difficulty sleeping or focusing, right? So it's an event that gets experienced by the individual as threatening or harmful that has a lasting adverse effect. And it can happen at any point in our lives, right?
Yeah, sure.
But it has the most profound effect when it happens during childhood, when the brain and body are still developing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And what would you say are some of the common signs or symptoms of trauma for youth and for adults? What do you normally see?
Sure. In children, we see things like extreme withdrawal, difficulty paying attention, some regressive behaviors like thumb sucking or wetting themselves, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, irrational fears, angry outbursts and fighting, depression, anxiety, feelings of shame and guilt. We also in the classroom especially see some really rigid black or white thinking and real deep frustration and anger over learning new skills. They just get frustrated so quickly and think that they can't do it, which is that black or white thinking.
Yeah.
Often emotional numbing and disassociation. Also physical complaints like chronic headaches, stomach aches, because again, those stress hormones are affecting the body, right, as well. You also see higher rates of autoimmune issues. So more chronic infections, harder for them to fight chronic infections, high rates of asthma, more GI issues, eczema even, things like that, because that, particularly for those kids that really experience significant trauma or chronic trauma, that constant release of stress hormones really can weaken their autoimmune system. And then moving into the teenage years, we see a lot of those same symptoms, but now we also see substance use, antisocial behavior, some suicidal ideation and self-harming, sexually acting out, unhealthy relationships, difficulty in school. And then into adulthood, you'll see a lot of these same symptoms, but now you also see some difficulty with, impulse control, empathy, difficulty with physical or emotional intimacy, hurtful relationships, difficulty keeping or maintaining a job, and continued mental health challenges and deepening substance use issues.
Okay. How can what happens as children, like the trauma in childhood or even teenage years, affect us as adults?
Yeah, a lot of times we think what happened to us as children were like that was 10 years, not 10, maybe 20,
Yeah.
40, 60 years ago. And we don't really connect those dots. But and maybe viewers might already know this. There's a groundbreaking study in the mid 1980s called the Average Childhood Experiences Study. And it asked about 17,000 adults, mostly, as it turns out, middle class, white, working, employed adults, about their current mental and physical health and their exposure to 10 different forms of what they called adverse childhood experiences, other words for childhood trauma. And those included physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, witnessing domestic violence, having a family member that was incarcerated, struggling with mental illness, or had a substance use, or divorce, right? So they're asking adults their experiences as children and their current physical and mental health. And they found shockingly high rates of exposure to adverse childhood experiences. About 2/3 had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and somewhere between 12 and 13% had experienced what we call toxic stress levels, so 4 or more different adverse childhood experiences. And for those that had experienced trauma and higher rates of trauma, what they saw was significantly more significant adult physical and health concerns, like increased rates of Alzheimer's, heart disease, stroke, cancer, suicide, depression, things like that. So what they really learned is what happened to us as children has a direct and long-lasting impact on us into adulthood. For example, individuals with an ACE score of 6, were significantly likely to have their life expectancy reduced by 20 years.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So what happens to us as children does stay with us in different ways.
Mhm.
And they actually did a follow-up study in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia ACEs study, where they really wanted to say, okay, if this was how significant adverse childhood experiences or childhood trauma is into adulthood for a predominantly white middle class employed community, what would it look like in a more in a community with higher concentrations of poverty and higher concentrations of communities of color? So they did the exact same study. They added in some additional ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, like experiencing systemic racism, witnessing or hearing violence, bullying, or experiencing the foster care system. And then with this study, the exposure to ACEs jumped from 63 to 80%. And those experiencing that toxic traumatic stress exposure jumped from about 12% to over 30%.
Wow.
So it doesn't mean poverty or being a person of color equates to trauma, but it does mean living in communities of higher concentrations of poverty with all the stresses of poverty. It's going to increase the likelihood, right, for some exposure. And certainly being a person of color, we've learned over this last year, if we didn't already know it, right, with just the constant exposure to systemic racism and police brutality on a pretty daily basis, right? It is traumatic, and it's also part of some of the racial health disparity that we see. So it stays with us. There's also the aspect of the epigenetics of trauma. So since we're all wired for survival, if we've experienced significant trauma, we can actually pass this on to our children through our DNA. Our DNA can get coded that to survive in this world, you need to be prepared for a violent and unpredictable world. You need a nervous system that can pump out more stress hormones. You need a larger amygdala, that's like that alarm center in the brain that senses danger, so that you can really, come into this world prepared to fight, flight, or freeze. And this is just one more reason for those of us with a trauma history to really do the hard work of resolving our trauma, to coming to a place of healing, so that we don't repeat unhealthy patterns of behavior ourselves, but also don't pass that on to our children as well.
I didn't realize that about the genetic part, so that's interesting to know.
Yeah, honestly, with this, every time they do a new ACE study, it just validates the original study. But with our deepening understanding of science and genes and how DNA and different things get coded and turned on and off, the epigenetics part is just how the research of childhood trauma is continuing to evolve. So.
Thank you that's a lot of really wonderful information, important information. So if someone's listening to this and they're saying like, oh, I have a child or I have a family member or whatever, and they're kind of checking off the boxes, whether they know about the individual's trauma or not, or they're just seeing these symptoms, I guess the next logical question would be, what can we do to help these individuals out?
Yeah, that's really great. And I always say when we're talking about trauma, and it's hard to talk about this subject, right? It is sad. And honestly, most of us, myself included, the research really tells us that ACEs are really common, right? So most of us have some trauma histories ourselves. So it's really important, I think, for everybody to understand what happened to us is only part of the story. Right. And it doesn't determine our destiny. We can all heal, as the brain can be hurt by trauma, the brain can be healed through safe, supportive relationships, right? Healing occurs through relationship. So, it's not all doom and gloom.
Right, right.
There is resiliency. There is even something called post-traumatic growth where, we can go through trauma and adversity. We can go through the healing process, and on the other end of it, have a deeper sense of compassion, empathy, a stronger, clearer sense of purpose and community connectedness and faith. So again, right, experiencing adversity and trauma does not necessarily mean this, doom and gloom future. But the key to healing really is the relationship, and having kind of safe support network around you. So if anyone's listening and wondering about it, I would really recommend, reaching out to someone that you trust in your support network. I really recommend, learning more about trauma and resources that are out there. And our website, Resilient Lehigh Valley, www.resilientlehighvalley.org. There's a lot of really good research and resources out there. And then also reaching out to some of the mental health professionals in our community. We're fortunate in the Lehigh Valley that we have a lot of really, really qualified and trauma-informed behavioral health practitioners in our community. So there is always help for those that want help.
Absolutely. And so what are some of the resources? I mean, I know you said that they're on your website, but are there a few that you can kind of share with us now?
Sure, yeah. So our website has, for those in the audience that are practitioners, it has different resources for different types of practitioners, an educator versus a healthcare provider, law enforcement as well. And there's also a section for parent and caregivers and community members as well. Mindfulness in general is a really powerful practice and powerful strategies to really help us with emotional regulation, help us grounding if we're experiencing a flashback, and really helps us connect with our body, really listen to our body, feel, really hear what our body is telling us. And really, because, trauma and even the flashbacks and the triggers, our body kind of seizes up and tenses with that negative energy, and that negative energy needs a release. Right. And so mindfulness is really just a healthy way of releasing that negative energy and really listen to our body for when we need that healthy release. And we've partnered with both the Pratya Sinha Foundation and also the Shanti Project to create lots of mindfulness videos. So those are on our website, also on those partner websites as well. And then we also have a trauma-informed toolkit that has lots of really specific tips, tools, strategies as well on our Resilient Lehigh Valley website, that has, different grounding exercises for if you're triggered, whenever we experience a trigger, whether it's a sense like a smell or a sound. Those are really common ones that kind of really take us back, particularly if we experienced that during childhood. And emotionally, we're back in that moment, right? We're back in that. So, grounding really grounding exercises really help connect the individual to, you're not back there, you're in the here and now, and really kind of connect folks through the senses back to the here and now. So different, strategies and practical tools like that are in that toolkit. So that's a great resource. And there are tons of other resources out there as well. Both of our counties, Lehigh and Northampton County, and the information referral, that's a great one-stop place to call and find out about providers and partners in the community as well. 211 is another great resource too. 211, if you're in need of any health or human service, you can call 211, say the community that you live in and the need that you have, and they'll that too. So lots of really great resources available.
Wonderful. Thank you for that list. I think that's a great way for someone to get started with finding treatment. And then if someone wants to reach out to you specifically, or, Resilient Lehigh Valley, what would be the best way? You mentioned the website already. Is there a phone number?
There isn't a phone number.
Okay.
But I'm happy to People
Yeah.
can have my cell number.
Yeah.
But if you go on the Resilient Lehigh Valley
Mm.
website and into the contact us, like the
Yeah.
toolbar at the top,
Yeah.
on the contact us, you can sign up for our quarterly newsletter.
Okay, great.
You can sign up for a distribution list. So that way you'll get information on any training we're offering or other event. We have an annual conference and we have tons of training opportunities throughout the year. And we also are kind of a big tent philosophy. So as I said, this is a broad cross-sector coalition. It's not just me and United Way trying to
Sure.
create community change. It really is all of us coming together. So big tent philosophy.
Yeah.
We have lots of different volunteer committees. We have one on data and measurement. We have one on training. We have one on community outreach and one on communications and advocacy. So anyone interested in engaging and volunteering in any of those ways is welcome to join any of those committees. And you can do that through the contact tab on the website too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like that was a lot of really helpful information in a short period of time. Is there anything else you can think of that last minute thoughts or tips or anything that you would like to share with our viewers?
Wow. I think this has been a rough year.
Yes, for sure.
Right. Rough year. And for those of us, I think in the behavioral health sector or the education sector, it's going to be a rough year ahead. Right. The needs and higher rates of exposure to trauma over the last year as well, not magically going away. Right. We're gonna, now that everyone's out of quarantine and back engaging in person again, we're going to start seeing that in community. And so I just really want to do another plug for self-care. I think we all talk about self-care, but really to prevent burnout for those of us that are practitioners, and those of us in helping industries, if we want to maintain healthy relationships with our own families, right, and our own friend networks, really, really, really need to not just say it, but do it. And for those of us that are supervisors or oversee programs or oversee departments, to really prioritize that with your teams too, because this has been a rough year, and likely for those of us in helping fields, it's going to be a few years of I think increased need as we hopefully work our way out of the impact of the pandemic. So really just focusing on that, I think, is really, really key.
Absolutely. Perfect. Couldn't have said any better myself. So thank you so much, Beth. We really appreciate you taking the time to share all this information. And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to listen to what we have to share. And have a wonderful evening. We will see you soon.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks, everyone.